This is Daniel Savage, and I'm presenting my missional helix on the topic of transitioning to a culture of discipleship. And the problem that I am thinking about is changing a culture that has traditionally been focused on numbers and decisions with a lack of emphasis on discipleship and thinking about how to transition a people who are entrenched in a sort of numbers-based measurement to thinking about not only winning people to Christ, but also making disciples. So first, I think we should think about what do we mean by a culture of discipleship? What do we mean when we say making disciples? So we'll begin with theological reflection. First, I want to think about probably the most famous passage which talks about making disciples, which is Matthew 28:17-20, which is the Great Commission. As Jesus is giving his final instruction to the disciples there, you know that he says to go into all the nations and make disciples. It says, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. And behold, I am with you always to the end of the age. Now, this well-known passage is often referenced when talking about discipleship, and the phrase, though, that I want to focus on in particular, that I think is relevant to what we're thinking about, is what it means to make disciples. First, Jesus says to baptize them, which I think we are good at and focused on, which would be, in my mind, making converts, that we're going to share the gospel, we're going to see people turn to Jesus Christ, and we're going to baptize them. But he continues with that phrase, which I think is often overlooked, where he says, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. That seems to be the area that we, in especially my context, have thought less about. So thinking about what does it mean to teach people to observe all that Jesus has commanded, and thinking about the full scope of what that means to make a fully fledged disciple that is also making disciples. Next, I want to think about Jesus' method for disciple making, that he was intentional and modeled for us what that was going to look like. Luke chapter 6, verses 12-16 shows some of that. It says, in these days he went out to the mountain to pray, and all night he continued in prayer to God. And when day came, he called his disciples and chose from them 12, when he named apostles Simon, whom he named Peter, and Andrew his brother, and James and John, and Philip, and Bartholomew, and Matthew, and Thomas, and James the son of Alphaeus, and Simon, who was called the Zealot, and Judas the son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. Now, when you think about this passage, Jesus has already collected here a group of disciples or followers, but in this passage he sets aside a few and calls them apostles, which means sent ones, and he singles them out for more attention and time and intentional teaching. He separates them and chooses to focus on them, and I think giving us sort of a method for discipleship. When he talks about teaching people to obey all that he's commanded, I think this is what he's talking about. Focusing on a few, multiplying yourself, and teaching them, and then sending them out. And the next thing that comes to mind when I think about discipleship is the idea of multiplication. You think about 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 2, where Paul is instructing Timothy what he's supposed to do in ministry. He says, and what you've heard from me in the presence of many witnesses, entrust to faithful men who will be able to teach others also. Now, Paul's instructions to Timothy here give us insight into how we're supposed to teach and pass on what we've learned about following Jesus. Paul had learned and modeled Jesus' example of multiplying himself with a small group of followers And here he's instructing Timothy to continue in the same thing. Take all that I have commanded you and pass it on to faithful men who will be able to teach others also. You see this kind of multi-generational approach to discipleship, where Paul is anticipating that Timothy would find people he would be able to teach, who would then be able to teach others. And this idea of multiplication seems to be the heartbeat of discipleship and what Jesus was intending. When he came to bring a message to the whole world but spent most of his time with 12 men, it seems obvious that this is what he had in mind. The next thing that I think about when I think about making a culture of discipleship is, what is a disciple maker supposed to look like? If you were to read the second chapter of 1 Thessalonians, you will see characteristics, I think, of a disciple maker, where Paul is describing his ministry among the Thessalonians. He uses words like he was with them, among them. He was willing to give not only his teaching, but his life, that he was patient, that he pleaded with them, that you'll read through there, and I think you can make a long list of characteristics of what we're looking for in a disciple maker. So that's when I talk about a culture of discipleship. That's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about seeing people not only converted, but then taught to follow and to observe all that Jesus commanded, until the point that they are able to teach others the same thing, with this idea of multiplication sort of baked into their thinking when it comes to passing on what they are learning from others. So thinking about that now, moving to cultural analysis, where we are now, the current culture at the church that I'm serving at, for the longest time, or as far back as I have been able to find, success and fruitfulness in ministry has been measured by attendance and conversions, especially noted in baptisms. Now, that's not something that is unique to us necessarily, but something that's pronounced in the way that we think. Success is measured by attendance and decisions. And I think it can lead to some of the wrong questions being asked, like when we plan things and calendars and events, we ask questions like, how can we get more people to come? Or how can we increase the number of baptisms? Instead of thinking about how to make disciples and encourage people to love Jesus more. And I think we're not intentionally omitting those questions, but I think that those questions have to be intentionally brought in to the paradigm, because it's just ways that we're not used to thinking. Like I said, it's not unique to First Baptist Church. Tom Rainer wrote an article about the Southern Baptist Convention where he noted some of these same trends across the board. He noted several things. An emphasis on numbers has dumbed down our membership requirements. An emphasis on numbers has led to us baptizing people who are not regenerate. An emphasis on numbers has caused us to emphasize decisions over discipleship, and I think that all those things are true. He made several other observations, which I have put a link to the article in the handout, which you can read more. But I think those are a good summary of some of the effects of focusing more on numbers than focusing on discipleship. So looking at the historical perspective, thinking about First Baptist Jacksonville and its long history, it has a history of numerical emphasis and a history of numerical success. From 1969 to 1988, Sunday school enrollment went from 2,385 to 14,172. While that is incredible and impressive, I think it has reinforced the emphasis on decisions and attendance as a mark of success. It seems to be just the way that we think about church, in these terms. You continue thinking about some more that I have found out about the history. The church staff has also reinforced this emphasis on numbers-based evaluation as a part of our in part of our history. With good intentions, the former pastors celebrated high attendance and numbers of baptism as an exciting thing, and I think they did so with good hearts and good motivations. But this taught the church that these numbers were the goal, not the fruit of what we were trying to do. And so it's created this focus on getting more people to come, and when less people show up, we see things as less successful rather than asking what other things were accomplished outside of just the attendance. Reaching this number of new people was certainly something to celebrate. The only negative was that there was little to no emphasis placed on making sure that these new converts were growing in Christ. It was just assumed that if they were added to a Sunday school class, they would grow. And I think that we're now seeing that that was not sufficient. That what we have is a lot of people and very few disciples, and even less disciple makers. So thinking about strategic formation, what do we do from here? How do we begin to change the culture? I started studying several people. One was a book that we read in class. It was by Trinity Jordan, the book Jesus Never Said to Plant Churches, where he talks about church planting methods and talks about discipleship and how it's an essential part of church planting. And his method, the thing that he prescribed and walked through, was a 4-step process where he talked about searching the scriptures to develop a rough sketch of what a disciple of Jesus looks like. I think that's a great practice to try to begin with the end in mind. What are we trying to produce when we say we want to make disciples? What do we mean? What does that person look like? What are we trying to create? Next, he said, commit to personally discipling others. I think that is an essential. If a church is going to be producing disciples, then the staff and the pastor have to be committed to personally making disciples themselves. He talks about, was specific to church planting, but he talked about not recruiting people to be a part of the early church planting process who will not commit to discipling others. I think that could be applied to your church leadership and Sunday school leadership, if that's what you're working with, is only recruiting people who are personally committed to this idea of making disciples. Last, he talked about this, and this was a recurring theme that I found in almost everyone that I studied, was develop a discipleship pathway. Decide not only the end game, but how are you going to get people from point A to point Z on your map. If you're trying to get to a certain location, determine what are the steps that people need to take to get there, and begin to talk about those regularly so that everyone knows what the next step is. The next person that I have studied a lot and have read his book, The Master Plan of Evangelism, several times. It shaped a lot of my thinking on discipleship. He lays out what he thinks is the model that Jesus used in discipleship, which was selection, association, this idea of being with them, spending time with them, consecration, setting them apart for the task, which comes from that passage in Luke 6 that we talked about earlier, importation, or giving them the teaching, demonstration, modeling ministry in front of them, delegation, begin to give them tasks, supervision, so you observe them doing the work of the ministry, and then eventually reproduction, where you've reproduced yourself. Last, I looked at Robbie Gallaty. Robbie Gallaty has been doing a lot of good work recently on discipleship and writing really helpful material. His method essentially breaks down to 4 things: commit to prayer, define reality, which he says language creates culture. So begin to think through what are you trying to communicate, decide a destination, what kind of disciple are you trying to make, and determine a pathway. And before I run out of time, applying these things then to First Baptist Jacksonville, how are we going to make a disciple-making culture at First Baptist Jacksonville? One, I think we have to change the measures of success. What is it that we are trying to achieve, and how can we measure success in new ways that would actually measure whether or not we're making disciples? And secondly, I think we have to change what we celebrate. We have to celebrate people who are making disciples. As lives change, as stories change, those are the things that we need to celebrate rather than attendance and conversions alone. Next, change the focus of the staff.